And let me start out by saying something that must be obvious to everybody, which is that love is a really difficult path. It's just not a bowl full of cherries. It's not a picnic on the grass, right? So you must recognize that in your own life. And I like to quote the singer-songwriter Leonard Cohen a lot. And he says that love is a cold and broken hallelujah. So it's a hallelujah, but it's one that will break your heart. So it's not a place where you are going to just have a good time. And I think sometimes people still do make a confusion about love and romance, love and idealization, falling in love, and actually having an enduring love. I think we've made a lot of mistakes in our society, particularly in these recent years. Confusing love with attachment bonds, I think, is a mistake. And I think that we are paying for that in not actually having a form of couples therapy that works very well in an enduring way. And so back in 1983, with my husband, Ed Epstein, who has died now from early onset Alzheimer's, we started a kind of couples therapy called Dialog Therapy for Couples, which combines psychoanalysis, and you could think Jungian psychoanalysis or other forms of psychoanalysis that deal with the unconscious interactive aspects of people's relationships to each other. So it combines psychoanalysis and psychodrama and some myth and fairy tales initially. And we started teaching and practicing dialogue therapy for couples. And then Ed actually began to develop a dementia in his mid-50s. And as a result of that, I stopped doing dialogue therapy around 2005 or so. And I didn't think I'd come back to it again. I didn't think that I would bring back the model or that I would be writing books about couples again. I wrote a book called You're Not What I Expected, Love After the Romance Has Ended. And then I wrote an earlier book called Hags and Heroes, which was a Jungian approach to psychotherapy for couples. So the reason that I came back to this topic is that I found that there wasn't really any kind of therapy out there that I could refer couples to that actually worked. So I was for a while just doing individual therapy for about almost 10 years. I wasn't seeing couples. And then I started looking into emotion-focused therapy, which is very, very popular, through a book called Hold Me Tight, and also the Gottman method, John Gottman's method of couples therapy, and imago therapy, which I knew quite a bit about anyway, and nonviolent communication. These are the ones that are popular. They're kind of combining, you might say, cognitive behavioral therapy and sometimes a little mindfulness or so on, that sort of thing. And I found with all of those models, there was not an understanding of unconscious communication that sets up a barrier where people repetitively engage in the same conflicts with the same words and so on, and they're never able to solve what it is that they're engaging with because something is going on unconsciously that they're not addressing. And it really cannot be addressed by just being held tight or being made to feel secure in your attachment bond. It can't be addressed by nonviolent communication. It can't be addressed by actually just sort of imagining your partner to be your best friend and so on. So the approaches that are out there for couples, and let's say the knowledge that's out there for people to read about their couple relationships, does not include a really important part of couple relationship, which is this unconscious affective communication. I'm going to talk a little bit about what that looks like tonight, but I wanted to put that on the table first and say that honestly, I did not want to write this book. I didn't want to get involved again with the whole landscape of love because there are really 1 trillion books out there, and that might be a reason why people think, oh, well, ho-hum, another book about relationship. Last night somebody said, I already know all of that. And so, I understand that there are lots and lots of books about relationship. I understand that there are a lot of methods that are offered, and sometimes kind of simple formulas for how you can, find your soulmate, or dive into something that, I know that there are various kinds of online counselors who work with people to kind of imagine their ideal partner, and the more they imagine it, somehow it's going to come to them. I've forgotten the name of that, but that's a method. It's like drawing the one to you sort of thing. And maybe, maybe you can draw the one to you, but that doesn't mean you're going to have an enduring love. I mean, it doesn't really matter where you start, whether you start with a soulmate or an arranged marriage. The issue about love is that you have to go through a process with that other person in which you remain interested in them and curious about them, engaged with them, and empathic with them over a long period of time and through a lot of difficulty. And so no matter how you get into the partnership kind of situation, that is just getting through the door. That's not actually getting the prize, or finding out what the secret is. I think we make a mistake right now in this period of time by emphasizing so much finding the right person. People want to find the chemistry. They want the right chemistry. They want the right sort of look in the eyes. I have so many people in therapy say, when I looked into this person's eyes, I could see whatever. Well, the emphasis there is on I could see. That doesn't mean a thing about the other person. So I'm going to say that romantic love, and I'll just mention other kinds of love in a moment, but romantic love begins with almost a psychotic delusion. We have this ideal for that romantic person, that the person is going to complete us, bring us something, give us something we've never had, or perhaps return the comfort that we had in early life. And so when we're in that romantic moment, especially when it's going in both directions, we look into the mirror and we say, well, I'm the fairest in the land. And the other person is also getting the mirror image, like I'm the fairest in the land, because this person sees me in this very ideal way. And at that moment, it's very intoxicating. And everybody loves that feeling of being sort of seen as very special, very wonderful, very amazing. As people say, oh, amazing, it's just amazing. And of course, that can't last. And of course, it is based on the same kind of idealization that we do with our babies. When our babies are born, we look at the baby and we say, oh, better version of me. This person's going to complete me. This person is going to do these wonderful things that I never could do. And of course, that idealization sets up something where that other person is definitely going to fall. And depending on how high it is, that will really kind of indicate how deep the pit is that they fall into. But there's no way that people can sustain that kind of idealization for very long, unless, as I say, with a couple, you live on separate coasts of the country. Sometimes you can sustain it for a while that way. And I have actually met couples that years ago we saw a couple where one lived in LA and one in New York, and I don't know, maybe these two have something like that going on. They keep laughing.
I have a partner in LA.
Oh, you have a partner in LA. Okay. And so, it's like that couple for 10 years, they were commuting. That puts a certain stress on relationship, but it keeps the idealization intact. And then they moved in together in New York. 2 months later, they were breaking up after 10 years of commuter relationship. So you can see that idealization requires this huge distance to maintain it. Actually, true love, in the way that I'm talking about true love, does require some distance. I'm calling it like a mindful gap, in which you're able to actually have the experience of yourself as an individual and the other person as a separate individual. And there's a sense that the other person is not making you do anything, feel some way, be some way. The other person is there more like a witness, and a witness who actually cares about you, and can see you and hear you and know you. In order to have that kind of witness, there has to be some space between you and the other person. So I'm going to cover a little bit of this handout, which is a PowerPoint set. I just pulled out some of the slides to kind of give you a clearer overview. Then I'm going to read a little bit from the book, and I'm going to read about that kind of unconscious communication. And so everything that I'm going to say here tonight is actually about love between equals. That's what the book is called also. And that applies to any love relationship in which there are two people who are adults. So it can be also an adult child and the parent. It can be two friends, but mostly we're going to talk about romantic love in that framework. And so there is something about being with an equal. And what do you think that is? What do you think it is that, let's say, kind of gives you that fingerprint or that sort of sign that you're with an equal? Anybody, just give a guess. Like, if you're with somebody that you feel is your equal, what do you feel?
Respect.
Respect, did you say? Yeah, respect. And what else? Anything else? Sovereignty, yes, that's right. Autonomy. You're allowed to make decisions for yourself. The other person's not controlling you, dominate. You're not feeling subjugated. You're not under their control. And so when you're with an equal, you feel the respect. You feel that autonomy. People make a mistake in believing that you should feel something like fairness, justice. You know, that there should be, okay, it's not fair. I did the dishes 3 times, and you've only done them twice. And so it's not fair that I would have to do the dishes again. That is something you need to get rid of, the idea of fairness in regard to an equal. Somehow we bring that idea in really quickly. But equality does demand these conditions in which we respect each other's autonomy. And that is very, very key. Consequently, you actually cannot control or even attempt to control the other person, even with your very best wishes. Like, oh, maybe you need to take a meditation class. Or, oh, I learned about this great exercise, so I'm going to read you the description of it because I think that would be great for you. Or, the smoking thing is kind of crazy. Everybody knows that smoking is harmful. And so if your partner smokes, unless your partner is a rock living somewhere, that partner knows it's very dangerous to smoke. And so telling your partner that your partner needs to stop smoking is not actually helpful. And it does seem controlling because you don't have the addiction, your partner has the addiction. So all of these issues that surround equality, that allow us to respect each other as equals, are made very difficult when we care deeply about the other person, right? I mean, we can do this with a stranger. We can treat our neighbors this way. But when it comes to someone we really, really care about, we have this feeling somehow that we need to tell them what we think would work best for them. And so that's one of the really difficult issues that come up for couples and also for adult children and their parents, going in both directions. Adult children tend to tell their parents a lot, too, about how they should invest their money, what kinds of property they should buy, a whole bunch of stuff that is just not welcome. It's not part of the deal. So that makes sense to you about equality. And so we're going to talk about couples, but we're going to talk about other kinds of love relationships, and feel free to ask questions about other relationships other than couple relationships. So there are a number of things that have happened in couple relationships in the 21st century, and I would say, especially, let's say, in the last 25 years or so, that have made couple relationship much more difficult. And so I call them the 3 wishes that we had for marriage. And we got all 3 of them. And they're on this 3 wishes for intimate love. The first wish is that we could choose anybody. The person didn't have to come from our tribe, the same background. The person could be, no matter what gender, tribe, or background, we are allowed to choose anyone, that's a right. The second wish is that we would have an intimacy that's based on equality and mutuality and reciprocity. In other words, there wouldn't be hierarchy. No one would be in charge. And the third wish is that the person become a witness, that the person be able to know us as an individual, hear us, feel us, essentially to offer that kind of mirror that shows you somewhat of who you are in someone else's eyes. That's what we wanted. We wanted somebody who would be someone we choose, that we fall in love with, someone who would be an equal partner, and someone who could serve as a mirror. Now, those three things, you put them together, and they drive everybody crazy. There is no way that you can do this without a lot of skill. And one reason is that in order to respect an equal and make all of the decisions that you have to make in a couple relationship where you're sharing home, money, maybe children, complicated schedules, all sorts of things, you're going to have lots and lots of conflicts about your needs, about your desires, about what you want, and so on. And those conflicts have to be handled with negotiation, because nobody is a top dog. There is nobody who's setting the rules. In the old style of marriage, you must have recognized by now that we're done with that style of marriage. There was essentially a kind of corporation that was established in the man's name and the husband's name, and that corporation was meant to go on over time. So generations were meant to pass the wealth down, and the children belonged to the corporation through the man's name. And the arrangements that were made about marriage were made so that generations could go on. The parents were together not for their personal needs, but so they could raise the children within this family, this tradition, and so on, and the land or the wealth or the business or whatever would be passed on through that family. So the whole framework for marriage as it existed until probably about the 1960s was really an impersonal arrangement. It was like a business setup, and people took the vow, till death do us part. And women particularly had to live by that vow because they had no financial independence. So they couldn't really easily leave. And even now, through much of the world, marriages are still arranged, and they are still functioning in this kind of hierarchy, and they're still focused particularly on the generations going on over time, not the experience of the two people that are in the marriage. And in fact, in some cultures, especially China, the two people that are in a marriage are not allowed to make decisions together. They're not allowed to have those kinds of conversations because those conversations undermine the whole point of marriage, which is to sustain the generations. So the model of marriage that my parents were in is completely different from the model of marriage that people are wanting now. And that's one reason why you cannot look to those old models for guidance, because people weren't free to leave. They weren't negotiating. They weren't treating each other as equals. And most of all, they were not intimate partners. They were in a business arrangement. My parents would have thought it would be silly to be best friends. My mother's friends were her women friends. My father's friends were his friends. They never looked at each other as friends. And in fact, they really clearly did not like each other. You know, they got married, and they were married for 51 years, and they got through it, and so, you know, and then my father died, and my mother was happier. And but it's true for a lot of people. It's not a rare situation. That was the deal. And so now what has happened is that we have made our vow essentially, I will stay as long as this suits me. I will stay as long as I feel good in this. That has changed the whole nature of marriage and enduring love. And if you can't see that, you make a lot of mistakes because you think, oh, all of my family members were married and went on for generations and so on, or, there must be this secret to staying together for a long time. Well, as George Harrison's wife said, the secret is don't get divorced. That's the secret to staying together for a long time. Now, that doesn't work so well anymore because you don't want to feel like you're in prison. That's not an equal relationship. That doesn't feel reciprocal. You want to have the feeling that you could leave if you wanted to leave. That's part of personal love. So I call what's going on now personal love. It's a love we take personally. When we fall in love, we start taking it very personally right away. You know, how well does this person listen to me? Honestly, it's almost always about me. It's not you. Usually about you, but it's about me. You know, many times people come to therapy and say, particularly women say, you know, I went out with this guy and he never asked me one question. I say, well, did you ask him a question? And she's, you know, usually she says, no, he just talked the whole time. He just talked. And I say, well, you know, maybe he was nervous, but, you know, you might have asked him a question. Are you nervous, for example? But so we are now caught in this kind of dynamic in which when we feel unfairly treated, it actually affects us physically and psychologically. And our self-esteem drops, and we feel like, you know, I have to get out of here in order to feel good about myself again. And the reason is that we take it very personally. It is actually about me. My mother stayed in a marriage 51 years. She really didn't like him. She didn't take it personally. She took that vow. She took that vow in a church. All of her sisters stayed married for all that time. None of them were particularly interested in their husbands. They weren't friends with their husbands. And when I say this, people go like, oh, that's really not so unusual. When Liz Gilbert, the Eat, Pray, Love lady, wrote the book Committed, she went first, she happened to be in Laos, and she went to the little village there, and she asked the women how they met their husbands, and they said, what do you mean? He was walking through town. You know, I mean, they didn't assign any special thing to meeting the husband. They needed to have children. And when she would ask them anything about their husbands, they would be like, why are you asking all these questions? You know, he's irrelevant to me. The men were off doing whatever they were doing, and the women were raising the children, and they were sitting around together, and they were doing their thing together. So that bond between the couple was not like it is now. And like I said, in many cultures, couples were not even allowed to have conversations together. Pretty much in Japan, married couples don't have conversations right now. So this love in the 21st century that we are attempting is a very, very new thing. And so I want to go through just the arc of it, and then I'm going to read a little bit from the book. So to move from personal love, which is the falling in love and taking it personally, to something that I call true love, which is the capacity to have an enduring love that is built around this witnessing of each other, where you actually come to know each other as individuals. To make that journey, you have to move from, it begins first with falling in love, some sort of idealization of the beloved, to a disillusionment, which usually is experienced as a lot of power struggles initially. And then after that, and not too long afterwards, the other person starts to seem to be, hurting you intentionally. So there's the sense that you're kind of with your enemy. You're not really with your friend now. You're with someone you have to protect yourself against, because when you start to try to make decisions about important things, like, how you're going to use your financial resources, or where you're going to live, or how you're going to decorate your home, or whatever, what happens is that you enter into something that feels personally hurtful, in which the other person is saying things to you, like last night, or it was Tuesday night, somebody said that, her husband says, can I give you some feedback? You're manipulative. Now that, of course, is an attack. That's not feedback. But this is the kind of thing that comes up between people when they try to actually solve their conflicts together. And so as they get into these repetitive, sort of back and forth, harmful, hurtful things, pretty soon they feel like they don't want to even try to solve their problems together. They'd rather just go off on their own. And so there's kind of an emotional alienation, and then that feeling that I'm with an enemy, I have to protect myself. People are usually then collect evidence that who they're with is really a narcissist, or has an addiction, or, has the wrong kind of heart or whatever, and then they tell their friends about that evidence. So then you have two teams that are kind of warring, and that can go on forever if you want. But if you want to change that, you have to start looking into yourself, at your own enemy-making factors, like how did this come about, that you would create this particular enemy? And lo and behold, you find that that person that you consider to be your enemy has some sort of traits in common with your mother, your father, your older siblings. Somebody that caused you a lot of pain in the past now seems to be across the table from you. And how did that happen? That usually has happened because actually you designed it yourself. And as Jung says, Jung wrote an essay in 1925 called Marriage as a Psychological Relationship. And he said, as soon as we start picking our partners, what are we picking? We're picking projections. We're picking someone who is unconsciously going to be in some sort of entanglement with us. And so you pick somebody who is going to be, lo and behold, just like your mother, father, sibling, or whatever. Not that this person is truly like that other person, but it's your screen, your film, your projection onto the person that is now capturing something, and then you're collecting evidence and you're building up a story, and you need to begin to see what you're doing. It's not about the other person. It's about you. As you go into that process, gradually you come to recognize that you and the other person are deeply flawed human beings who are deeply unconscious, who need each other to know yourselves, and that you're dependent on the other person. The other person's welfare will really deeply affect your life as well. So you start to recognize that you're going to have to relate as a whole self to another whole self, a person, yourself, who has strengths and weaknesses, to a person who also has strengths and weaknesses. Once you get to that point and you begin to treat the other person in a mindful, respectful way, and you're able to go through your conflicts with this sense of respect in something that I call mindful dialogue, which really takes a lot of skill, then you actually enter into the path of true love. And over time, you come to know both yourself more deeply and the other person as an individual. And that kind of enduring love provides something that cannot otherwise be found in life. It provides a way of feeling at home on earth. I mean, most of us actually do not feel at home on earth. I just heard from my son yesterday that in some surveys that are done, 80% of people say that they've come from another planet, that they're not from this planet because they don't feel comfortable here. They feel like they belong someplace else. I just think that that's kind of an indication of how uncomfortable we feel with ourselves. We often just feel as though somehow we're in the wrong place at the wrong time, or something went wrong with us, we're defective, or our situation is defective. And really, it's because we haven't deeply accepted whole self. So by loving someone and experiencing ourselves over time, we actually have this possibility of feeling at home on earth because we feel comfortable with a person who knows us well as a witness, even though that person doesn't know us perfectly well. Neither do we know ourselves perfectly well, but we come to see that that's okay. It's okay to not know yourself perfectly well, the other one perfectly well. It's okay to be with somebody who is imperfect. And yet, just by that enduring love, that accompaniment, the other person becomes more and more mysterious. You realize you don't know exactly who that person is, even though they're very familiar. And so that combination of the mystery and the familiar is actually, it's kind of like God. God is meant to be, for people, familiar but mysterious. And so there's something deeply spiritual about that experience, and you can get it through this kind of love. And you could not get that typically through the traditional marriage. Now, some people, the rare individual, found a soulmate in the past and could marry that person. Rarely. More often, the soulmates were found outside of marriage, so you could have sex with that person while you were married to this person over here. That was the more common sort of thing. in the past. I mean, if you know anything about the history of marriage, which I know quite a lot about, in the Middle Ages when marriage became a law, at that point, the only way to really have a kind of soul partnership was outside of marriage, because marriage was a contract. It was like a corporation for business. It's the business of raising a family. And this kind of romantic love was something that you could only do when you had leisure and you could relax and have sex and so on for pleasure. And of course, it was typically the wealthier people, but sometimes not. But over time, finding a soulmate was a very rare occurrence, still is, to find one. But to make one in this way is not a rare occurrence if you follow this practice or path of love. So there are two components that I think are very important for love to endure. The one is the knowledge of your beloved, that you actually come to know your beloved. And the other one is the enduring engagement, interest, and desire for your beloved, so that your beloved is never boring. You never feel like, oh, I know what you're going to say before you say it. Don't say it, because I already know what you're going to say. That way of thinking has nothing to do with the other person. It's just you putting down the other person, because everything changes all the time. So does your beloved. So your beloved, even if your beloved is telling you this story that he or she has told you many, many times, that person is telling you that story now for some reason right now. It is not just the same story. So again, when you put a different framework around these kinds of things, they become really clear. And so let me see if there's anything else I want to say about the arc of love. So I want to read a little passage from the book, and then we'll talk, okay? Is this making sense so far? Is it making sense to you? And the kind of therapy I do with couples, and the kind of therapy I'm teaching, and there's somebody here who's in the training right now, is to enhance this capacity to practice true love, to practice it. Now, the book is full of Buddhism, but Buddhism, not Buddhism light, but Buddhism transparent, I would say. It's Buddhism for anybody. But it is the genuine framework that the Buddha held up about the nature of reality, that this reality that we're in has these characteristics of being suffering, that is, nothing works perfectly well, it's not perfect, and that it's constantly changing, so it's not permanent, and it's also very interdependent, and so it's not personal. So it's not perfect, it's not permanent, it's not personal. And that really is the nature of love. And once you see that, even though you take it personally in the beginning and you're looking for someone to match you and so on, but once you see that it's a spiritual path that you're following that brings you to that which is both mysterious and familiar, you begin to see that it's not just a path for you. It has to do somehow with being a human being and having a witness. And so that actually, let's say, is the goal of all of this, all this broken hallelujah stuff. But the book has a lot of Buddhism in it. I think very easy to understand Buddhism, but it's a little different from having a lot of mindfulness teaching in it. Mindfulness, I think, has kind of reached its consumer levels where it almost can't be, I think, commercialized much more, I hope. But the whole idea of mindfulness at root is this ability to actually pay attention with deep acceptance, something called equanimity. That is, you can continue to pay attention to somebody who is telling you that they voted for Donald Trump because you're interested in that person, and you are not interested primarily in just reacting through your own feelings and opinions. And you can do that if you cultivate this capacity to pay attention in this way. Many people practice mindfulness without ever cultivating that capacity, which is what the Buddha intended in the first place, which is that you not react impulsively to what you're experiencing, even if it's painful. So it's sort of like the bumper sticker that I would like to make, do not freak out. That's kind of underneath is do not freak out. No matter what your beloved is saying to you, do not freak out. Just stick with it. Be interested. Remain curious if you can. And then you can follow this path. So that makes sense? I'll read a little bit from the book. And so personal love in marriage requires a whole new set of skills and insights. It demands a readiness to develop as an individual, which can be a frightening and a challenging reality for many people. Personal love requires partners to change their views of themselves, to develop an ability to tolerate conflict and negotiate differences, to take responsibility for their own emotional habit patterns, and to be open to new insights about their partners. It is the development of these skills that is the focus of this book, the skills to help you navigate this new kind of committed relationship. Fundamentally, as I contend throughout the book, when marriage shifted from being a hierarchical institution into a personal and equal arrangement, it changed the meaning of both marriage and divorce. Wanting a partner who gets you and affirms you, someone who can be a witness and a friend over time, means that staying in an unhappy marriage now feels like you are being untrue to yourself. By the way, when I use marriage here, I simply mean a committed relationship, whether or not it's gone through sort of legal things. Marriage has shifted from being a loyalty to a family identity into being a loyalty to your personal identity. For many people, this desire for witnessing from a partner has also meant an exclusive focus on the intimate relationship for solace and friendship, often at the expense of other relationships outside of the partnership. As a result of all these factors, staying in an unhappy marriage can lead to seriously diminished psychological, social, and physical functioning for an individual. Staying in an unhappy marriage makes people sick now, and it creates an undermining of self-esteem. Considering all this, our high divorce rate, which is about a little over 50% for first-time marriages and about 65% for remarriages, can be seen as a sign of health, in that people feel better when they get out of conditions of personal wounding instead of staying in them for the sake of appearances. Some psychological and social pundits have suggested we've placed too many demands on marriage. I think instead that we are still uninformed and deeply confused about what is required for personal love to succeed and become true love. As our circumstances and needs have changed over centuries, we have dramatically transformed marriage, but we have not transformed ourselves within it. Instead, we have mistakenly focused almost obsessively on the ideal of making a good match, or fulfilling an ideal of the right chemistry for sexual attraction as the basis for a happy marriage. We've also become confused about what having a commitment means. Some tend to treat commitment as a prison, while others idealize it and assume it should be a paradise in which all conflicts or differences just magically dissolve. We're also unskilled in negotiating conflicts with an equal whom we cannot dominate or control. We may refuse to take responsibility for our own feelings and experiences, demand the submission of our partner, or take a submissive role ourselves. Most critically, we want to fall in love, but we do not understand or endorse the necessary process of disillusionment that must follow from that romantic beginning. We want the expansion of romance, but not the contraction of disillusionment and the loss of the idealization of our partner. So I said I was going to talk about this unconscious communication, but I'm not. I'm going to just turn to questions, and if you have questions about it, I will try to answer those. I can say this one thing about it. The hallmark of this unconscious communication is when the two people repeatedly say the same things to each other in a predictable way that they can even anticipate themselves, and they never seem to be able to come to any resolution in that repetitive conflict. That's the hallmark, that you're each trapped in each other's internal theater, unconscious dynamics from earlier relationships, and you're playing those out each from your own side. So there's a term for that in psychoanalysis. It's called projective identification. And that really is the thing that suffering couples suffer from. They really suffer from that more than from anything else. And so when they come to couples therapy, if the couples therapy does not specifically address that, it will not actually cure the suffering in the couple relationship. So I've just said a whole bunch of stuff, and you guys have been very patient and enduring me talking and talking. So, ask me questions, or tell me about your own lives, or what you're interested in, or whatever. Oh, and I didn't talk about multiple partners, yes, which is another thing that actually makes love very difficult in this period of time, because attachment bonds, while they don't explain love, they do explain a lot of anxiety. And anxiety actually gets stirred up very much when your attachment bond is threatened. And so multiple partners do threaten the bond. And there's just no way you can get around it unless you are sort of a sociopath, which you're not, I can tell already. No, I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I don't think so. Now, you've just got everybody separated up, so it sort of works in a way that way. But the thing about once you have sex with somebody, I don't know how many times, but I'd say 3 to 6 times, just to kind of give it a number. It's been my experience in working with people in therapy. A bond forms. And that bond is like the same kind of bond that a mother and a child have. It's based on the same kinds of actions, because mothers and babies, they hug and kiss, and they use baby talk, and they rock and they sway, and they do a lot of things that lovers do. We do the same things, except then we have sex as well, we have genital sex. But that whole sort of dance of an attachment bond, it's called pair bonding in adulthood usually. It forms when you have sex repeatedly with somebody. You'll feel bonded to that person, even if that person is a criminal or somebody that you otherwise wouldn't care much about. And then when that person threatens the bond, or when you threaten the bond, you could be threatening it yourself. You have anxiety, and it's called separation anxiety because it's the anxiety that threatens the bond, threatens separation of the bond. That usually is a cycling through of something like agitation or rage or protest into kind of despair and then apathy. And that's what you see in toddlers when you drop them off at the nursery, or if you drop them off permanently, they actually go into grief in that last part. So once you formed an attachment bond, you identify with the other person, you search for them when they're absent, you feel separation anxiety if the bond is threatened, and you feel grief if it's lost. And that's biological. And it doesn't give you a lot of wisdom, but it gives you a lot of impulse. It doesn't mean that you're really going to get to know that person, but it certainly means that you have anxiety about the person when they're missing. So multiple partners, that has not typically worked for human beings. Serial monogamy has worked for human beings, but not what people call polyamory these days. And, people tried it in the 70s, sort of swinging or swapping or whatever. I've seen so many people who lost their primary relationship through that. And then I've seen their children in therapy, too, people who knew that their parents were doing that and felt very undermined by it. I think the reason why it feels so anxious for humans is because we do form pair bonds. And again, they're not perfect pair bonds, but they usually are pretty possessive pair bonds because that's the way we're hardwired from our infancy time.
Can you speak on when you're talking about attachments, and then there's of course the Buddhist sense of attachment?
Yeah, that's different.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what about that?
So that kind of attachment, the Buddhist sense, the actual word is thirst. That's the word in Pali that's used for the second noble truth. What causes suffering is this kind of thirst. And what the Buddha would say, it's what you grasp onto is what, and then you cling on to that for security. That can be an opinion, it can be an ideal, it can be a substance, and it could be a piece of furniture, or a car or whatever like that. It's generally not a person exactly. It's your fantasy about the person. And that in this period of time, what I find really is kind of the second noble truth is that people are very persuaded by control. They like to control things. They like to eat certain things. They like to do so much exercise. They like to do this and that just in this way or that way because then they think they're going to be safe, So it's more like that feeling than it is like separation anxiety. We worry about, what's your partner doing over there on the West Coast or whatever. That's a more biological thing. So adult pair bonding is a very normal kind of thing, and it's part of our biology. And I don't think you can get past it. I think you're going to have the anxiety even if you tell yourself that you're not, because that's the way human beings bond. And there are a lot of hormones that once you're pair bonded to somebody, your hormones change, all sorts of things change. It's sort of like when you have your own children. I mean, I don't know how many of you have children, but if you do, you might have noticed that you feel differently about your own children than you feel about those children over there, even though you're compassionate towards all children. But your children, you're like, and those children are like, oh, So it's like when you have your own thing that you're bonded to, there's a lot of response to that. And it's the same with pair bonding. You bond differently to each individual child. And again, if you've had your children, you kind of know that. And you don't bond equally. This is another big secret. Parents don't equally love all their children. We say that we equally have, but you just don't, because you can't, because they're all different, and you have different feelings about them. And yeah.
Following up on that, I guess I'm interested in this idea of love between equals and adult-child parent context maybe, and being stuck in this, what you're describing as the disillusionment phase for many, many years.
Yes.
And how I think part of the reason you get stuck is maybe you don't shift into that, especially the parent has trouble shifting into the equals idea.
It could be either one.
Or, either one. Maybe how you think people might shift out of that.
There's always one key, whether you're in a partnership or with your parent, or I don't know if it's the parent you're thinking of. It's that you become truly interested in the other person and their actual experience. And so you ask them questions with a true interest in finding out. And you can tolerate what they say because you're not just reacting to it from your own point of view. I like to give my mother as an example because I had really secure attachment bond with my mother. And I grew up in the Catholic Church, and she was Slovenian, so she's very Catholic. And then, when I got to be about 22, I took Zen vows. I took Buddhist vows. And it was a long path for me, but it was very serious. It wasn't like a lot of people that got into Zen because they took LSD. That was not my approach to Zen. But so I wanted to talk to my mother about Buddhism and about what I discovered. And she could not tolerate it. She didn't want to hear a thing about it. It was like, no, I don't want to hear about that. And sometimes parents do that. Don't tell me about that. Don't tell me, if you're going to ride that motorcycle, just ride it. Don't tell me about it. That sets up, again, this sense of disengagement. Like you're doing something that hurts me so much, I can't tolerate hearing about it. And so really that means I'm not interested in you. You just go do your thing and then come over here and do the things that I want you to do, and then we can talk about those things. So it's that real interest in what the other person is experiencing. In psychoanalysis we say it's like the interest in the subjectivity of the other person, that they have a world and that world is meaningful and you're interested in it.
But do both parties need to have that intention?
No. And the book talks about love on a two-way street and love on a one-way street. So love on a two-way street is like true love because both people are vulnerable. Both people are actually engaged in the same way. Love on a one-way street, you can come to love your parent by actually being interested in finding out that world. Who is that person and what was that person? And the person might not return the favor. And that's true in a lot of relationships. You can, what I call, cherish the other person. You become a mindful witness, you become engaged, you do the things that you would do on a two-way street, but you're always kind of protecting yourself because the other person's not open to you that way. But still, you come to know them more completely, and there's more pleasure in it. But when it's on a two-way street, there's vulnerability both ways. Both people have a stake in things going on permanently or over time, not permanently, but over time, to endure. Love on a one-way street, therapists do that for their clients. They love them on a one-way street. Parents sometimes do that for their children. Of course, when they're young, your child can't reciprocate like that. And, we do it sometimes for friends or other people that just cannot actually be interested in doing that for us. But when it's on a two-way street, it's much richer. And some parents and children do come around to that. They come around to a true friendship. But I think it's rare enough because there'll be self-protection on one side or the other. Anybody else? Anyone else have a question? Yeah.
I was just wondering how people can truly and deeply love someone else if they abhor themselves.
So love, if you really love someone, will bring you to love yourself. If you truly love. Like sometimes, when I talk about love, because I think of love as a way of relating to almost anything. Like if you love bird watching, you have to get to know the birds, right? You have to get to know the birds and the equipment and so on. And you're always interested. Every day you're interested to go out to see the birds. Pretty soon when you're watching the birds, because you love the birds and you're interested, you think, that bird is teaching me something about myself. I'm looking at this bird, but the bird actually, I noticed that bird I feel kind of like I'm like that bird. And so I'm learning something about myself by watching that bird very carefully. And, the more you engage in that, the more it can bring you back something about yourself. When you're with another human being doing that, if you're truly loving the other, there should be some way in which you are also learning about yourself. And I think that self-hatred is actually based on some sort of imposition of ideals on your own experience that you feel like, you didn't measure up in some way. And when you come to love another person deeply, and I know this even from loving people in therapy, you see that the imperfections of that person actually make them more lovable. It's not like the imperfections make them somehow, like you don't like them. In fact, perfection isn't really very lovable. And so then you start to say, maybe in myself as well, the imperfections make me lovable. The perfections, they're just not human. Being human. It's not perfect. And in fact, the world we're in is not perfect. It's not. Nothing's perfect here. I mean, you must have noticed that. Nothing works for very long, and any solution becomes a problem in the end. So, once you start to see that issue of imperfection, you bring it to yourself. And you say, maybe I could love myself for my imperfections. I make a lot of mistakes. I make some very interesting mistakes. And I've come to really enjoy when I make a mistake, I forget something or I overlook something, because then I like it. It makes me feel like, I'm just like other people in that way. And I'm sure if you watch the birds, you'd find them making mistakes too. I mean, it's just like everything doesn't work well. That's sort of, so it does bring you around to loving yourself eventually if you really love something else. You're welcome. Okay, I think we're probably out of time. I mean, I know there was some sort of time limit. I could go on, but it is about 25 to 8. One more question. Is there anybody that has a question or anything that you've been wanting to ask, but you haven't asked, because I'm sure everybody else would want to know the same thing. Anybody?
I just find myself thinking over and over, to love fully is to be interested in the other person.
Yeah.
I do find myself thinking about the same story over and over and over and trying to be interested in order to love fully, and that there's just a complete disconnect.
I'm sorry, when you said the same story, what did you mean?
You mentioned sitting and having somebody tell you the same story over 35 years of marriage.
Right.
And trying to love them fully with a lot of interest.
How about if you imagine that wasn't the same story? It's sort of like your ears have gotten bored with it. It's sort of like your ears have said, same story. Actually, people tell their stories. I mean, I know I do this. I mean, I have some jokes or stories or whatever I like, but I'm bringing them out in different situations for different reasons. And so, I check with myself, what am I bringing this out for at this moment? Like, the broken hallelujah thing, I bring it out again and again. And so, people bring out things for different reasons at different moments. So there's a lot of different ways to be interested in somebody's story. Certainly, I'll tell you, in doing so, I don't know if you're a psychotherapist, but if you are, you're not. Okay, so you wouldn't know this, but when people actually sit with you in psychotherapy, because we're all sort of somehow wired by that original family that we were in, because we had to survive, so we had to adapt, so we had to form habits, so we have certain views of ourselves and the other people in the family that are very repetitive. So the therapist has heard this 1,000 times about the mother being an alcoholic and doing this and that. And so when you've heard it 1,000 times, now you cannot just go in therapy where you're getting paid a lot of money. I've heard that 1,000 times. You got to stop right now because I know that story. So you listen again, and you're kind of listening for, at this moment, this person is telling me this story again. At this moment, it's significant in a new way. Is the person telling me covertly about me? Is she telling me covertly about something that happened today or what? I'm listening. I'm interested. So I'm engaging with that thing over and over and over again. And it's always giving me a new angle, a new way of seeing the person. And so I would suggest that in your everyday life, that when your partner or anybody sort of dives into the same material, that you think about the possibility that your ears may not be the best guide. You might actually think to yourself, can I be interested? Can I ask a question? Can I get a view on this or an angle, or even ask the question, can you help me understand why you're telling me that right now? What is it about this moment that you want to communicate this to me? And knowing also that, I don't know how many people like Buddhism. It seems like these days everybody likes Buddhism. But, one thing that Buddhism teaches, it's like the fundamental thing is nothing is permanent. Everything changes all the time, including the story. It's like that story is not an exception to the law of the universe. So it sounds the same, but it's not the same. And it's not being told in the same context for the same reasons to the same person from the same person. All of that has changed since you last heard the story, or since you believe you last heard the story, because another thing that couples do is that, the one person says, well, yesterday you said such and such. The other person says, no, I didn't say that yesterday. Because they have different memories. I mean, we can hardly remember what we had for breakfast, We don't have a tape recording going in there, inside, that just knows exactly what happened. So you say to yourself, well, I've heard that exact story before. Maybe not. Maybe it's elaborated differently now. So I would never go with the idea that you've heard that story before. And as soon as you get into that as a kind of a mantra, like same old story, I've heard all of those stories already. As soon as you get into that, you are really stuck, and you're stuck in yourself. You're stuck with your own judgments.
It's a torturous place to be.
Well, yeah, you're stuck with your own judgments, you know. And so, I mean, another way of saying this is everything is really, really pretty interesting if you can just get off your high horse, you know, if you can just recognize that maybe you don't know exactly what's going on. It really is. I mean, I'm not saying that as a criticism of you. I'm talking about all of us together. That, you know, what's going on here? What's going on right now? You know, we're just showing up here together. We have no idea what's going on. I don't know either. I mean, it's all kind of a mystery that's unfolding. And certainly that's true in a relationship. And so, again, if you just get rid of the idea that you already know and that you know best and that you have some kind of recording inside of you that knows exactly what's going on, if you can sort of drop all of that, everything gets more interesting right away, including your partner. But then your partner is the one person you really want to nail down and say, you know, I know that I already... So, you know, it takes a little more discipline to lighten up on that person. So, does that make some sense? Some way?
It does. It's
Yeah.
kind of...
Good. You can read the book. The book will help you with it, too. It really will. Okay, everybody. Thank you very much for being such a good audience.